Hello everyone, Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Alright, continuing with the opening of the eyes, I find that this is a very, very auspicious moment to be reading this Gosho and exploring it with you. And the reason I say that is obvious in my own life experience, but from the questions I'm being asked from some of you. Specifically here in the United States, there's a lot of consternation around the upcoming election. There's a lot of very strong emotional feelings about the situation, and the question comes to me usually in the form of, how should I practice? How can my practice affect any of this? And part of that is compassion toward other, but part of it is honestly self-preservation. Questions, comments that say things like, sometimes I just wish ... would happen. Disturbing thoughts that we don't like to have, but we feel backed into a corner, so our fear rises up and our emotions rise up. And we start to think things we don't like to think. We are human. This is part of how we're built. So it's a darn good question. How do I use my practice to encourage myself, encourage those around me, to affect some sort of change? And as I was just asked, how does compassion figure into all of this? First of all, I want to say, yes, we're experiencing this viscerally in the United States, but you have to also remember, not to think nationally, but the fact that authoritarian dictatorships and fascism have been rising throughout the world in the last few decades. We have some countries right now struggling with incredible conflict and death and mayhem at the behest of religious views and persecution. I could name some, and some of you will get triggered by these things, but the reality is there's tremendous conflict going on between Israel and Palestine. As it relates to Buddhism, Myanmar, or previously Burma, it's horrific what's happening in some of these countries. Need I mention North Korea? I don't know that's a religion of a different sort. That's a cult of religion of a certain family, but still a cult of religion. Brazil. Anyway, I don't want to make this a political program, but if any one of you is the least bit informed, you'll understand that this is a condition that is much worse in some areas and showing its ugly head here in the United States, and it's prevailing greatly. Now, for those of you who've studied a bit, you see that, yes, in fact, this is a prediction from Shakyamuni Buddha all the way through Tendai and Nichiren and several other scholars and Bodhisattva. This is the age of defilement. This is the age of greed, anger, and stupidity. And we see it manifest, but seemingly every year it seems to manifest in a form that we didn't quite expect. We keep expecting it to roll back or dial back a little bit, or saner minds coming into control, and it doesn't seem to be happening. So not to be a naysayer, I want to look at this situation again from a Nichiren's standpoint. He lived in a transitional government, and a time of a mixture of fanatic nationalism versus fanatic, I could say fanatic, but endemic withdrawal, rule by power, authoritarian, and the demise of a previously very kind of a mystical worshiping emperor, kind of, kings, queens, emperors, so on, as deification of individual humans. So a lot of things were changing in his day, and they were dealing with a lot of this. And so I bring all of this up because we touched on Shoju and Shakubuku already, and that's still a very confusing issue to many people. It's like, when do you do Shoju? When do you do Shakubuku? And how do you judge that? So what I'm about to read, I think, makes it abundantly clear what's appropriate, depending on what your environmental circumstances. And your environment includes your political, country identity, countrymen activity, so on. So let's get into it. I suppose the learned priests of the time think it only natural that one should have doubts about this. Therefore, no matter how I explain and try to persuade my own students, disciples, they still cannot seem to overcome their doubts, but behave like ichantikas, or persons of incorrigible disbelief. Therefore, I have quoted these passages of explanation from Tendai, Miaolo, and others in order to silence their unfounded criticisms. These two methods of Shoju and Shakubuku are like water and fire. Fire hates water. Water detests fire. The practitioner of Shoju laughs with scorn at Shakubuku. The practitioner of Shakubuku laments at the thought of Shoju. Now, I don't know what each of you's experiences have been with different groups practicing Buddhism, but I've certainly witnessed in my own time these very conditions. When the country is full of evil people without wisdom, then Shoju is the primary method to be applied, as described in the Peaceful Practices chapter. So this is from the Lotus Sutra. So I would encourage you to read the Peaceful Practices chapter, because in this country, we are dealing with what Buddhism was termed, remember, evil represents people who dissuade you from practicing your full potential. People who try to derail your Buddhist practice. People who try to, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because that's where I think the confusion comes. But evil people, when we read the sutra and when we talk about Buddhism from the scholarship, we understand that the practice of the complete teachings of Buddhism, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, is a matter of life and death. And it's the life and death of our enlightenment. It's the life and death of our highest potential, our higher selves, our best maximal participation and immersion into the opportunity that this life gives us to be excellent human beings. If somebody derails you from that or influences you in a negative way so that you yourself derails you from that, then that influence is evil. All right? When we say evil, we're not talking about monsters in the dark or you'll see the different distinction in a minute, because we'll come back to this word evil, but it will have a different meaning. Now, at a time when there are many people of perverse views who slander the law, then Shakubuku should come first, as described in the Never Disparaging chapter. So these are two chapters in the Lotus Sutra that describe these two conditions of practice. Now, to be clear, when he says perverse views who slander the law, he is talking about people, whether it's through their politic or their religious beliefs or their personal anima, that persecute you for your Buddhist practice, that ridicule you for your Buddhist practice, that try to run you out of town for your Buddhist practice. You want an example of that? Myanmar. Look at what's happening in Burma. Buddhists, and not just Burma, other Asian countries, where Buddhists are being shot, actively persecuted, and some Buddhists reacting poorly. It's war. It's no different than the hardcore Islamists who are ripping apart Yemen with the Arab states pushing their version of Islam, just slaughtering people, starving them to death in Yemen. And the other countries that are complicit in that activity, they support it. That's evil, okay? But it's evil of perverse views that actively run out, and in this case, slandering the law is about Buddhist practice. So I don't think we've reached that in the United States yet. I'm not aware of it. You might be shunned or ridiculed, but from ignorance, not from trying to run you out of town. So Nichiren is pointing out, when these people hold these slanderous views, when they come after you, then Shakubuku, which literally translates to the breaking of bones, is about halting the misperceptions and correcting these others' misperceptions to end their persecution of Buddhist practice. This is a very different situation than what we see in Shoju, where there is a lot of evil, but evil bred more of ignorance than malice. When we get to perverse views and slandering the law, these are people who are actively practicing malice. And that means Shakubuku, because what does that mean? As Buddhists, we're not, as many would used to think, or may still think, as pacifist vegetarians. We are actually very staunch and stalwart in our practice. And we will compassionately allow ignorance and slowly correct it, Shoju, with compassion and friendliness and calm. But if you come to end us, we do stand up to you. We do have a spine. We're not warring. We don't look for a fight, but we won't back down from one either. That's Shakubuku. Does it make sense? Does that sound clearer? And again, I pointed these two chapters in the Lotus Sutra. Once again, the peaceful practices versus the never disparaging practice. Now you understand that the title alone kind of gives you some insight, doesn't it? Peaceful practices are Shoju because they're guidance toward understanding. Whereas never disparaging means we stand up for ourselves, but we don't do so at the expense of others' dignity. Shakubuku isn't about grinding other people's nose to the ground like so many religions do. We don't want to establish superiority. We want to establish understanding and cooperation. That's a different kind of a stance. That makes sense? It is like using cold water to cool yourself in hot weather, or longing for a fire when the weather turns cold. Grass and trees are kindred to the sun. They suffer in the cold moonlight. Bodies of water are followers of the moon. They lose their true nature when the hot weather comes. So, that's kind of poetic, but he's trying to show that Shoju and Shakubuku are very related, like the seasons are. But there are appropriate conditions for either. In the latter day of the law, however, both Shoju and Shakubuku are to be used. Now, this is incredibly important, and I want to read it again because there's so much misunderstanding about this. People who think, well, we're in the defiled age, Shakubuku's the only way, we just have to break the bones of the unbelievers. And then there are others who claim that, no, that's too radical, that was appropriate in shogunate days, but today we use shoju, and mild influence, and mindfulness, and blah, blah, blah. Very clearly, in the latter day of the law, are we not in the latter day of the law? However, both Shoju and Shakubuku are to be used. And yet, understand, he wrote this at the time of the shogunate. But tremendous amount of turmoil in his country at the time. And he was vilified quite a lot. And still, he points to the fact that not everyone is the same. Not all conditions are the same. That the country, especially a country in transition, has pockets of enmity, and pockets of compassion and seeking spirit, looking for answers. Looking for answers doesn't always look pretty, but it's not confrontational, not in a way that's perverse or denying of other opinions. There are subtleties here, but I think there are also clear delineations. This is because there are two kinds of countries, and if you'll allow, countries are not only bordered by national states, but countries are also bordered by streets, communities, the walls of your home, the walls of your rooms. You and I are different countries. We may be very similar, and we may have very similar goals, and we may live in, nationally speaking, the same country, but we are nonetheless different countries in the context of this Gosho. The country that is passively evil, and the kind that actively seeks to destroy the law. Again, he's making this distinction. There's a difference between bad influence, from ignorance to misunderstanding and ridicule, to actively trying to destroy. That's a big leap. We must consider carefully to which category Japan at the present time belongs. So he's talking about his own situation in this case. Question. If one applies the Shakubuku method at the time when the Shoju method should be appropriate, or Shoju at a time when Shakubuku would be appropriate, is there any merit to be gained? Answer. The Nirvana Sutra says, quote, Bodhisattva Kashyapa addressed the Buddha, saying, quote, the Dharma body of the thus come one is as indestructible as a diamond. But I do not yet understand the means by which you acquired it. Would you tell me? End quote. The Buddha replied, Kashyapa, it is because I was a defender of the correct teaching that I have been able to attain this diamond-like body. Kashyapa, because I, in the past, devoted myself to the correct teachings, I have been able to achieve this diamond-like body that abides forever and is never destroyed. Good man, defenders of the correct teachings need not observe the 5 precepts or practice the rules of appropriate or proper behavior. Not appropriate, proper behavior. Rather, they should carry knives and swords, bows and arrows. The monks, whom you are speaking of, preach various teachings, but still they are not able to utter the lion's roar, Myoho Renge Kyo. Nor are they able to refute and convert evil persons who go against the correct teaching. Monks of this kind can bring no benefit either to themselves or to the populace. You should realize that they are in fact shirkers and idlers. Though they are careful in observing the precepts and maintain spotless conduct, you should realize that they cannot achieve anything. Then a monk raises the lion's roar. Those who break the precepts upon listening to his preaching are enraged are all enraged to the point where they attack him. This preacher of the law, though he may in the end lose his life, is still worthy of being called a person who observes the precepts and brings benefits to both himself and others. So, making it clear, I think, here, that if you adopt one position or the other, you are actually impeding your own growth, your own practice, and you are not practicing Buddhism correctly. Because if you adopt the idea that only Shoju will work, you will shirk your responsibility when having to rebuke those who wish to shut Buddhism down. And that is not practicing Buddhism correctly. Sometimes the situation calls for strong action, stalwart words, rebuking misperceptions. It's essential to bolster your own practice, as well as to help not just the person who's misreading you, but anyone in the vicinity and anyone who's influenced by both you and that person. When they walk away long afterward, they will have a different opinion. Whether they express it correctly isn't the issue. It is in their mind that you have rebuked them effectively. Whether they then want to redouble their efforts against you or not isn't the matter. It's about attitude and intent. What's going on inside is how we communicate our Buddhist practice. We use words, but words have intent. And depending on the intent, the words will behave differently. In the passage from On the Nirvana Sutra quoted earlier, Chang'an says, "You should let your choices be fitting and never adhere solely to one or the other." So, in other words, it could shift in the middle of a conversation. Somebody could simply be ignorant and you're practicing Shoju to bring them to understanding, and then something triggers them and they become either violent with words or with attitude, or they shut down, or you know what I mean? People will get argumentative and fuel their own fire, at which point you need to use something to quell that fire. And if Shoju doesn't work, you might have to resort to staunch admonishments, Shakubuku, but never disparaging. Never ridicule for the sake of breaking somebody's spirit. You want them to come to the truth, even if it's difficult. Right? The medicine story from the father and his 3 sons plays out here. And Tendai, as we have seen, declared that, quote, "the method chosen should be that which accords with the time." And time is something that's constantly changing in each and every moment. He's not talking about the 1900s versus the 2000s. He's talking about in the moment, time changes things, as I was just saying. If it is not, you will be like someone who plants seeds at the end of autumn. Though you may carefully tend the field, you are not likely to harvest any rice or grain. During the Kenin era, so there it is again. Using the agriculture as an example. If you plant at the wrong time of year, no matter how well you do your job, you've done it at the wrong time of year, the season won't support it and you won't gain anything. So it's the same thing with Shoju versus Shakubuku. All of this comes back to practicing, as you see, this is elliptical in a way. It keeps coming back to one's own practice. Because if your attitude is one or the other, you are diminishing your own practice. You are not actively practicing in moment to moment your life to its maximum potential, Buddhism, correctly. During the Kenin era, 1200 to 1201 to 1204, two men came to prominence, Honen and Dainichi, who spread the teachings of the Nembutsu and Zen schools, respectively. Honen denied the worth of the Lotus Sutra. Now that the world has entered the latter day of the law, saying that not a single person ever attained Buddhahood through that sutra, and that, quote, not even one person in 1,000, end quote, can be saved by this teaching. Dainichi, for his part, claimed that the true teachings of Buddhism had been transmitted apart from the sutras. These two doctrines have now spread throughout the entire country. The learned priests of the Tendai and the True Word schools fawn on the lay supporters of the Nembutsu and Zen schools the way a dog wags its tail before its master, or fear them the way a mouse fears a cat. And Nichiren has no compunction about Shakubuku, does he? He points it out. You're doing this wrong. Why? Because they're defiling the teaching. That evil is perverse views pushing away the true teachings. These men enter the service of the ruler and the military leader, where they preach in such a way as to bring about the destruction of the Buddhist law and the ruin of the country. These Tendai and True Word leaders, in their present existence, will fall into the realm of hungry spirits, and after death will find themselves in the Avicii hell. Even if they retire to the mountain forests and engage intensely in the meditation on the 3,000 realms in a single moment of life, or retire to a quiet spot and concentrate on the three mysteries of body, mouth, and mind, if they do not understand the time or the people's capacity and perceive which of the two methods, Shoju or Shakubuku, is appropriate, then they can never free themselves from the sufferings of birth and death. In other words, they can never attain awakening or enlightenment. Question. When you berate the followers of the Nembutsu and Zen schools and arouse their enmity, what merit does that bring? See, there's that very important question. Well, aren't you yourself being evil because you're pursuing them? Again, this is a misperception. The evil is about correctly practicing Buddhism, and those that would detract you or send you the wrong way. That's a much worse offense than somebody who's simply ignorant and doesn't know any better. The attitude and the influence, the intent is far graver, right? We do this in Western law. We have different degrees of criminal offenses depending on the premeditation or accidental, different ranges, right? From manslaughter to murder 1, right? Answer. The Nirvana Sutra says, if even a good monk sees someone destroying the teaching and disregards him, failing to reproach him, to oust him, or to punish him for his offense, then you should realize that that monk is betraying the Buddha's teaching. But if he ousts the destroyer of the law, reproaches him, or punishes him, then he is my disciple and a true voice hearer. Chang'an comments on this as follows, quote, one who destroys or brings confusion to the Buddha's teachings is betraying them. If one befriends another person but lacks the mercy to correct him, compassion, one is in fact his enemy. So not an enemy of Buddhism, but an enemy of the person who's mistaken, because he fails to correct him and put him on the correct path. But one who reprimands and corrects an offender is a voice hearer who defends the Buddha's teaching, a true disciple of the Buddha. One who rids the offender of evil is acting as his parent. Those who reproach offenders are disciples of the Buddha. But those who do not oust offenders are betraying the Buddha's teachings. Okay. Something came to mind as I was reading that. I like to use secular examples from time to time. So, if a teenager, if you're a parent, or maybe you know somebody who kind of obsessively talks about or acts in a way that they want to take their own life. You feel it in your gut. You want to discourage them from that kind of cause making, that kind of thinking, that kind of attitude. You want to redirect them in a better way. Shoju. But if you see that same kid, or maybe it's a different person, and you see them putting a noose around their neck, or picking up a gun and putting it in their mouth, do you not immediately endeavor to secure the rope away from them, to knock the gun away, punish them, yell at them, what are you doing? Try to get sense going in their head, take the gun away, forbid them from having access to the gun, and sternly rebuke them for what they're doing? Don't you emotionally want to do that? That's Shakubuku. Does that sound bad? Does that sound ugly? It may sound violent, but it's required. It's required because now the situation has gone past idly thinking and ignorance about taking one's life. It's gone to actually making the cause to do so. It requires shakubuku. It requires talking sense into somebody. This is sometimes a fine line, but sometimes it's a very obvious line, right? Now that doesn't mean kick the crap out of him. Say you think before you pick up that rope again, or I'll beat the crap out of you again. That's a threat. That's disparaging. You see the difference? To be stern and to demand change is not disparaging. It is compassionate. It is what is required in that time, in that situation. Does that make sense? If we examine the treasure tower chapter of the Lotus Sutra, we find Shakyamuni Buddha, many treasures Buddha, and the Buddhas of the 10 directions, who are emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha, gathering together. And why? As the sutra itself says, quote, each ... has come to this place on purpose to make certain the law will long endure, end quote. Shakyamuni, many treasures, and the other Buddhas intend to ensure the future propagation of the Lotus Sutra so that it can be made available to all the children of the Buddha in times to come. We may surmise from this that their concern and compassion are even greater than those of a father and mother who see their only child inflicted with great suffering. Honen, however, shows not the least concern about their compassion, but would tightly shut the gates to the Lotus Sutra in the latter day of the law so that no one would have access to it. Like a person who tricks a demented child into throwing away a treasure, he tries to induce people to discard the Lotus Sutra, a shameless thing to do indeed. If someone is about to kill your father and mother, I think I use secular examples. Here we go. If someone is about to kill your father and mother, shouldn't you try to warn them? If a bad son who is insane with drink is threatening to kill his father and mother, shouldn't you try to stop him? See the difference? Warning versus stopping. One is intervening, the other is teaching. Shoju Shakubuku. If some evil person is about to set fire to the temples and pagodas, shouldn't you try to stop him? If your only child is gravely ill, shouldn't you try to cure him or her with moxibustion treatment? Whatever that was of the day, but certainly some kind of medical treatment, right? To fail to do so is to act like those people who see but do not try to put a stop to the Zen and Nembutsu followers in Japan. As Chang'an says, if one befriends another person but lacks the mercy to correct him, one is in fact his enemy. So it's pretty black and white in Buddhism. Everything is related to our attitude, our behavior, the way we conduct ourselves within society. So once again, the Lotus Sutra and these Bodhisattvas teach us that Buddhism can be an insular solo practice, but it is incomplete unless we consider our environment and those around us. That is when Buddhism flourishes both in ourselves and in our environment. That is the way of practice. This is what Shakyamuni taught. This is what every bodhisattva keeps coming back to, even though so many teachers over the days, either for personal gain, political gain, power, whatever it was, tried to shift these teachings to be some solo monolithic teaching that was deeply personal and had nothing to do with others other than somehow mystically affecting them. This is insufficient. This is not the complete practice. We have to engage with our environment. Otherwise, we deny our very existence, because we wouldn't exist as human beings if it were not for the environment we live in, like a fish in water. Take away the water, the fish dies. Right? I, Nichiren, am sovereign, teacher, and father and mother to all the people of Japan, but the men of the Tendai school, who do not refute misleading teachings, are like great enemies of the people. As Chang'an has noted, quote, one who rids the offender of evil is acting as his parent. Again, evil. We understand now what that means, right? It's not somebody in a black mask. It's somebody who, knowingly or unknowingly, is a negative influence and spouting negative, destructive, to Buddhism specifically, thoughts and ideas. One who has not conceived a desire for the way can never free oneself from the sufferings of birth and death. Shakyamuni Buddha, the Lord of Teachings, was cursed by all the followers of non-Buddhist teachings and labeled a man of great evil. The great teacher Tendai was regarded with intense enmity by the 3 schools of the south and 7 schools of the north, and Tokuitsu of Japan criticized him for using his 3-inch tongue to try to destroy the 5-foot body of the Buddha. The great teacher Dengyo was disparaged by the priests of Nara, who said Saicho has never been to the capital of China. But all of these abuses were incurred because of the Lotus Sutra, and they are therefore no shame to the men who suffered them. To be praised by fools, that is the greatest shame. Now that I, Nichiren, have incurred the wrath of the authorities, the priests of the Tendai and True Word schools are no doubt delighted. They are strange and shameless men. Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in the Saha world. Kumarajiva journeyed to the Qing dynasty in China, and Dengyo likewise went to China, all for the sake of the Lotus Sutra. Aryadeva and Aryashima sacrificed their bodies. Bodhisattva Medicine King burned his arms as an offering, and Prince Jogu stripped of the skin on his hand and copied the sutra on it. Shakyamuni, when he was a bodhisattva, sold his flesh to make offerings, and another time, when he was a bodhisattva named the ascetic aspiration for the law, he used one of his bones as a pen to write down the Buddha's teaching. Tendai has said that the method chosen should be that which accords with the time. The propagation of the Buddhist teachings should follow the time. For what I have done, I have been condemned to exile. But it is a small suffering to undergo in this present life, and not one worth lamenting. In future lives, I will enjoy immense happiness, a thought that gives me great joy. And with that, we now enter the background. That is the end of the opening of the eyes. So he ends with quite a flourish. And interestingly enough, he ends on a note on the differentiation of Shoju versus Shakubuku. And I think that's notable, because I think the opening of the eyes is a teaching that takes the student on a journey from the discovery of the Buddhist teachings, the history of the Buddhist teachings, the proper order of the Buddhist teachings, then slips into the proper attitude to practice the correct and full Buddhist teachings, and ends on a note on how we embrace the Buddhist teachings in our daily lives, within our environment. So again, the point is made throughout the opening of the Eyes Gosho that once you arouse the desire to learn Buddhism and awaken and enlighten your own life, you must study broadly. You must develop your resolve. And once developed, you then have the tools and the prepared mind to interact with others in an appropriate way, to either encourage and influence them, whether they practice or not, or defend the teachings entirely with those who would try to drag the teachings down. Not necessarily you alone, not attacking you personally, but attacking either you or anyone else, or the teachings in general. They need to be corrected. This is your charge. This is your practice. It wouldn't be happening in your environment if it weren't part of your karmic reality. So all of it is Buddhist practice. This is the opening of the eyes. With that, I thank you so much for watching and playing along. Stay encouraged. Write me in the comments. As always, truly appreciate your participation just watching these videos. If you can, go to Patreon, go to PayPal, go to Kokoscope, find a way to support this school, my practice, and yours, our Sangha. Some people have made donations of video equipment when they heard that I was struggling with the ability to create videos with my old computer equipment and so forth, and I thank those people tremendously. All of it that promotes the work of Shakyamuni Buddha, Nichiren, and our dissemination of correct information is laudable and deeply, deeply appreciated. Take care of yourself. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo.